Close your eyes and let your mind drift back to February 1955. It was a time when the air didn't just feel cold, it felt sharp. So sharp, in fact, that the frost began to crack the very window panes of our homes. Outside, the snow fell with a relentless silence, piling up until it completely buried the garden gates. The temperatures didn't just drop, they rewrote the record books entirely. But it was one particular afternoon in January that remains etched in the memory of Londoners. Daylight simply vanished. At 1:15, a thick, suffocating darkness fell over the capital. Thousands of terrified people reached for their telephones, ringing the emergency services in a panic, convinced that the world was finally coming to an end. This wasn't merely another winter cold snap. No. This was Britain gripped by two brutal spells of ice and snow, a season that would test every single family, every local community, and every last ounce of that famous British grit. From the turn of the new year until the middle of March, life in this country became a daily battle for survival. We weren't fighting an enemy we could see. We were fighting the frost that crept into your bones and simply refused to let go. The winter of 1955 to 1956 wasn't merely a long freeze, it was savage. For those who endured it, the memories of those bone-chilling months would remain etched in their minds forever. It all began in the very first week of January, when a brutal cold front swept down from the north, burying London under 6 inches of snow. It was the heaviest fall the capital had seen in nearly a decade. At first, people hoped it might only last a few days. They were wrong. The frost held its grip tight until late January, and then it came roaring back with even greater fury in early February. On the 23rd of February, 1955, history was made in the small highland village of Braemar. The mercury plummeted to a staggering -25 degrees Celsius. It was the coldest temperature recorded anywhere in Britain since the 19th century. 60 years of winters had passed, and nothing had been colder. Up in Scotland, the landscape vanished under 2 feet of snow, while near Elgin it reached 3 feet. In the far north and the islands, massive drifts piled up to 30 feet high, swallowing entire villages behind walls of blinding white. The situation became so dire that the RAF launched Operation Snowdrop, dropping vital food and supplies from the air to families who were completely cut off from the world, trapped in a silent, frozen wilderness. Down in the south, even places like Buxton were buried under 2 feet of level snow. Roads simply vanished, railways froze solid, and Britain, a nation still weary and recovering from the scars of war, suddenly found itself in a desperate struggle against the raw power of nature. But February wasn't finished with us yet. On the very day Braemar set its chilling record, Cornwall was hit by 16 hours of continuous, heavy snowfall. Cornwall, a place that barely sees a frost most years, was transformed into a landscape resembling the Scottish Highlands. It was as if winter itself had decreed that no corner of Britain would be spared. Life at home became a relentless, daily struggle for survival. You see, most houses in 1955 had no central heating to fall back on. You relied entirely on a single coal fire in the living room, if you were lucky enough to have one. Families would huddle together in that one room, trying to catch a flicker of warmth, while the rest of the house turned into a literal icebox. Your breath would mist in the bedroom, and ice began to form on the inside of the windows, creating delicate frost patterns that were beautiful, yet terrifying, because they meant the cold was winning. In those days, coal was everything. Without it, you simply froze. But the sheer brutality of the cold made deliveries nearly impossible. Lorries were paralyzed by the drifts, and coal sat frozen at the depots, while families were forced to burn whatever they could lay their hands on. Old newspapers, broken furniture, anything that would catch a flame. The heavy smell of coal smoke hung thick over every street, a constant, choking reminder that survival meant keeping that fragile fire alive at all costs. The winter was relentless. Mothers were forced to defrost milk bottles in pans of hot water just to give their children a drink. Little ones would spend their mornings scraping thick ice off bedroom windows just to catch a glimpse of the pale daylight. And fathers, wrapped in every layer of clothing they owned, would trudge outside to clear paths, only to find them filled with snow again by nightfall. There were no shortcuts, no easy ways out. You simply endured. But as February dragged on, the situation became even more desperate. Farmers watched helplessly as the frozen ground made it impossible to harvest a single vegetable. Root crops were locked deep in the earth, solid as stone. In some areas, the frost was so deep that heavy machinery had to be used just to dig up potatoes. Thousands of tons of food that should have fed a hungry nation simply rotted in the soil. For the elderly and the vulnerable, this winter was more than a hardship. It was a deadly threat. Hypothermia became a terrifying reality. Doctors would make house calls through snow that reached their waists, clutching medical bags that were half frozen, struggling to reach patients who had no way of reaching them. Hospitals filled to the brim, with pneumonia spreading through communities already weakened by years of post-war struggle. Yet, through the biting wind and the rising drifts, Britain carried on. You didn't complain. You didn't wait for a miracle. You simply got on with it. Then, on the 16th of January, something truly extraordinary occurred in London. At 1:15 in the afternoon, daylight simply vanished. The pollution from 1,000,000 coal fires had collided with a freezing weather front, creating a layer of smog 4,000 feet thick. The city was plunged into an eerie, unnatural midnight. Light levels dropped to 1,000th of their normal strength. Terrified citizens called the police, genuinely believing that the world was ending. It took hours for that heavy curtain of darkness to lift, leaving behind a haunting reminder of just how punishing this winter had become. But here is the part of the story that often goes untold. The winter of 1955 wasn't just about the struggle for survival. It was about the birth of a community. When the cold became truly unbearable, the famous British Reserve simply melted away. Neighbours who hadn't spoken for years began knocking on each other's doors. They shared their last buckets of coal, their blankets, and whatever scraps of food they could spare. Strangers would spend hours helping a neighbour push a frozen car, and families opened their parlours to anyone whose pipes had burst or whose fires had gone out. In church halls and smoky community centres, people gathered, not just for the warmth of a heater, but for the warmth of company. You'd sit with folks you'd never even met, sharing stories, playing a hand of cards, and drinking tea that somehow tasted better, simply because someone else had poured it for you. Amidst the struggle, There was laughter, too. Somehow, we found that dark, defiant humour that only the British can truly manage. We made jokes about penguins taking over Piccadilly Circus and snowmen queuing up to apply for their own ration cards. Even the BBC, calm and collected as ever, reported the chaos with that classic, dry understatement. Heavy snowfall has affected most areas, they would say. Travellers are advised to take care. No panic, no drama, just a quiet, stubborn acknowledgement that yes, things were dreadful, but we would manage. And for the children, well, for them, it was pure magic. When the schools closed, and they closed quite often back then, the frozen world was transformed into a giant glistening playground. We didn't have fancy equipment, but we had imagination. Sledges were fashioned from old tea trays or heavy baking sheets borrowed from the kitchen, and we flew down every snow-covered hill like Olympic champions. Snowball fights would erupt and last all day long. Kids would come home soaked to the skin, frozen stiff, and absolutely grinning from ear to ear. Our parents didn't fret about safety helmets or thermal gear. Instead, wool socks were hung to steam by the fire, and gloves grew stiff with ice on the hearth. The very next morning, we'd be right back out there, building snowmen that stood taller than the adults. If you ask anyone who was a child in that remarkable winter, they will tell you the same thing. It was magical. It was the best winter of their lives. Because when you're young, snow isn't a hardship. It is freedom. The bite of the frost finally began to soften. In the middle of March 1955, the world started to weep as the ice turned to water, dripping steadily from every rooftop. The roads reappeared like old friends, and when the first delivery trucks rolled through the slush, they were greeted like returning heroes. Britain, tired, frostbitten, and covered in the soot of 1,000 fires, finally began to breathe again. When the milk arrived, truly liquid for the first time in weeks, people stood on their doorsteps and actually cheered. But the thaw revealed the scars the winter had left behind. Farms had lost their livestock, crops were ruined, and businesses had been silenced for weeks. The cost to the nation was immense, not just in pounds and pence, but in the heavy toll it took on the health and spirits of the people. Yet, beneath the hardship, there was a strange, quiet pride, a sense that we had been tested by the very worst of nature, and we had not broken. The winter of 1955 taught us a lesson, not about the weather, but about resilience. When the supplies ran out, and it felt like the darkness would never end, people didn't give up. They looked after one another. They kept their fires burning, and they got through it, together. There were no smartphones to check the forecast, no central heating to keep us warm, just neighbours, community, and a stubborn British refusal to be beaten. It wasn't comfortable. It certainly wasn't easy. But for those who lived through it, it was unforgettable. Because the winter that nearly froze Britain solid also reminded us of what matters most. Not the warmth from a radiator, but the warmth from each other. Were you there during those frozen months of 1955? Do you remember the silence of the snow, or the way your community pulled together? Please drop a comment below and share your story with us. Let's keep these memories alive together.